In a time when the echoes of the Norse gods still whispered through the mountains and fjords, Norway, once united under the iron will of King Harald Fairhair, had crumbled into a shadow of its former glory. The days when Fairhair had subdued every rival king and ruled the land as one had long since faded into legend. With his death, the fragile unity he forged shattered. The petty kings once humbled beneath his sword rose again, each declaring themselves rulers of their own fragmented realms. Fairhair's descendants, bound by blood, yet torn apart by ambition, waged relentless wars for the throne, plunging the land into chaos. Amid this turmoil, a giant known as Haakon the Poweful, said to be a descendant of the legendary Ivar the Boneless, seized control of the country. Yet even he was but a vassal to the Danish King, signalling the end of Norway's independence. The mighty House of Fairhair became a distant memory, its legacy fractured as its descendants scattered across the land, content to rule over mere scraps of what once was a mighty kingdom. But fate had not forgotten the Fairhair bloodline. From the ashes of a broken Norway, one man would rise to reclaim the legacy of his forefathers. Olaf Haraldsson, the great-great-grandson of Fairhair, would embark on a journey that would carve his name into history, not just as a king, but as a saint. Born a pagan, with his blood-stained axe seeing countless battles, he would be remembered as a saint. This is his story. Olaf Haraldsson was born in the dawn of a new millennium, in the year 995, destined for greatness in a land fractured by ambition and war. His father, King Harald Grensk, a proud yet humble ruler of the Vestfold, carried the blood of Norway's first king, Harald Fairhair. Though Harald Grensk was a descendant of legendary kings, his realm paled in comparison to the unified kingdom his forefather had once ruled. Olaf's mother, Asta Gudbrandsdatter, was a woman of noble spirit, known for her generosity and high-mindedness. Yet, according to the sagas, even her virtues could not hold Harald's wandering heart. Driven by ambition and desire, Harald set his sights on a new bride, Sigrid the Haughty, the wealthy and formidable widow of Sweden's King Eric the Victorious. According to the ancient sagas, Sigrid, a woman as cold and ruthless as the northern winds, spurned Harald's advances with fire and fury, having him and his fellow suitors burned alive in a great hall after a feast meant to celebrate their proposed union. In the aftermath of this tragedy, Asta gave birth to a son, Olaf Haraldsson, who would one day rise far above the station of his forebears. Not long after, she remarried, this time to Sigurd Syr, the petty king of Ringerike. As Olaf matured, he was said to be middle of height, but was a very thick man and strong, being known to some as Olaf the Stout. He had light brown hair and a broad face, which was white with a red hue. He had particularly fine eyes, which were beautiful and piercing, so that one was afraid to look him in the face when he was angry. Olaf was an expert in all bodily exercises, with strong arms and shoulders. He was amazing at spear throwing, swimming, and also was an excellent conversationalist. In addition, he was noted to be a master with the axe, for which he would later become famed for. Olaf, with the blood of Harald Fairhair running through his veins, was not content to work on his stepfather's lands. So when he turned 12 in the year 1007, Olaf went Viking and would join a war expedition. Olaf would learn the way of the oar and was a rower to begin, but his party would soon make their way to Denmark. A ballad was made about a young Olaf during his first Viking expedition. Young was the king when from his home he first began in ships to roam, his ocean steed to ride, to Denmark o'er the tide. Out from the distant north, mighty hast thou come forth. Towards autumn, he sailed eastward to the Swedish dominions, and there harried and burnt all the country, for a young Olaf would have his vengeance, and he had a good cause for hostility against the Swedes, as their queen had killed his father Harald by treachery. Olaf would soon have his first taste of battle. A Swedish warlord named Sot, renowned for his ferocity, dared to challenge Olaf and his men. Though outnumbered, Olaf's warriors had the advantage of larger ships, and a brutal sea battle would unfold. As the enemy vessels drew near, Olaf's men hurled grappling irons, latching onto the closest ships and dragging them in. The clash that followed was savage and swift. Olaf and his warriors stormed the enemy decks, cutting down their foes with ruthless precision. The air was thick with the sounds of steel and the cries of the vanquished. In the chaos of battle, Olaf's strength shone like a beacon. Though still in his early teens, his might was already the stuff of legend, earning him the epithet Olaf the Stout. Overwhelmed and broken, Sot's Vikings fled, leaving behind a sea stained with blood. After many victories in Sweden, Olaf set his sights on Finland, which would result in the Battle of Helga. According to the sagas, during this conflict, Olaf and his men were ambushed by the Finns in the woods. Olaf lost many men, but made it back to his boats. He ordered his ships to depart despite a rising storm, attributed to the enemy using witchcraft. Despite these events, Olaf and his crew survived, although it nearly cost a young Olaf his life. In his early teens, Olaf had already carved a path of conquest through Sweden, Finland, and the Baltic coasts, leading countless raids and expeditions, growing in both reputation and wealth, his name becoming a force whispered in fear across the lands. Battle after battle, the young warrior proved his might, enduring trials that would break lesser men. By the time he faced his fifth battle, he had become a seasoned fighter. This fateful clash took place in Friesland. Olaf and his men stormed the shores, but the people of the land were ready, charging down to meet them on horseback. The battle that ensued was fierce, with Olaf at the forefront, wielding his axe like a storm. Sigvat the Scald recounts of Olaf's might. Under King Limer's cliff, this battle is the fifth. The brave sea rowers stand, all on the glistening sand, and down the horsemen ride, to the edge of the rippling tide. But Olaf taught the peasant band to know the weight of a Viking's hand. Olaf, driven by ambition and the taste of conquest, soon set his sights on Denmark, where he forged a powerful alliance with the legendary Joms Vikings and their towering leader, Thorkell the Tall. Together, they embarked on a fearsome campaign of plunder across England, their names soon to be etched in infamy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts in grim detail the devastation wrought by these fierce warriors. The Vikings, relentless and ruthless, swept through Essex, Mercia, Wessex and Kent like a storm, leaving a trail of ashes and despair in their wake. Everywhere they went, Olaf and Thorkell led their bands of hardened fighters, plundering the miserable Saxon people, robbing them of their wealth, and mercilessly cutting down any who dared to resist. The years 1009 to 1011 marked the relentless raids that turned the English countryside into a land of shadows, where smoke rose from charred villages and the cries of the fallen echoed through the night. The Vikings' most infamous conquest came between the Nativity of St. Mary and St. Michael's Mass, when the Viking horde turned its gaze to the great city of Canterbury in Kent. Olaf would have been around 16 at this time, but was still as cunning as he was brutal. He and Thorkell would discover a treacherous path into the city, guided by the whispers of a Saxon townsman who betrayed his own people for survival. Through this secret passage, they infiltrated Canterbury's defences, seizing the city in a whirlwind of steel and fire. The Archbishop of Canterbury, a symbol of the English spirit, would fall into the hands of the Vikings, becoming a prisoner. The city's treasures were pillaged, its people slaughtered or enslaved, and the once great city was left as a smouldering ruin under Viking rule. As the land burned and the people suffered, Olaf and Thorkell grew immensely rich, their coffers overflowing with the spoils of war. The Danegeld, vast sums of gold and silver, were paid to them by the desperate English in hopes of buying peace, a futile attempt to halt the marauding tide. The riches they extorted only fueled their power, and England, now a land of misery, lay under the iron grip of the Viking conquerors. Yet, in a twist of fate, the very king they had tormented with sword and fire sought to turn these fierce raiders into allies. Through delicate negotiations, Aethelred, the King of England, managed to sway the warlords. Thorkell, enticed by both power and wealth, agreed to ally with the king and took Aethelred's daughter as his wife, binding his fate to the royal house. Olaf, ever hungry for more gold and power, would follow suit, swayed by the promise of great riches and influence. In this unexpected alliance, the once ravaging conquerors found themselves at the king's side, no longer enemies, but uneasy allies, their swords now wielded in the service of the realm they had once torn apart. Thus, the saga of Olaf and Thorkell took a new turn, from terrorizing warlords to powerful lords within the very kingdom they had once sought to destroy. However, the fierce Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, with a mighty army, would soon seize the kingdom from Aethelred. The Danes had spread their power far and wide across the land, and it had come to such a dire point that Aethelred was forced to flee from his own country, seeking refuge in Normandy. But fate would soon intervene. Sweyn, the conqueror of England, would suddenly die in the dead of night, his body found lifeless in his bed. Englishmen whispered of divine justice, claiming that the ghost of Saint Edmund, the long-dead King of East Anglia, had struck him down, as revenge for his cruel murder by Ivar the Boneless. When word of Sweyn's death reached Aethelred in Normandy, he wasted no time. He returned to England with renewed vigour, rallying all who would fight under his banner to reclaim his stolen kingdom. Warriors from every corner of the land flocked to his call, and among them came Olaf, leading a formidable force of Northmen. Already sworn to the English king, Olaf and Aethelred came to an agreement that Olaf would take Northumbria should Aethelred regain the throne. Thus, together, they set their sights on London, steering their fleet into the Thames, where the Danes held a fortified stronghold. Across the river lay the bustling trading hub known as Southwark, where the Danes had constructed mighty defences. Great ditches surrounded the stronghold, and within its walls of stone, timber and turf, a fierce army awaited. King Aethelred ordered a massive assault, but the Danes, hardened by war and commanded by Prince Canute, the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, fought back with relentless ferocity, repelling every attempt to breach their defences. A broad bridge spanned the river between the castle and Southwark, so wide that 2 wagons could pass side by side. Barricades, towers, and wooden parapets lined the bridge, rising nearly to chest height, while beneath the waters, piles had been driven deep into the riverbed. Here, the Danes stood firm, defending their position with every ounce of strength that they had. Desperate to capture the bridge, King Aethelred gathered his chiefs to devise a plan. It was then that Olaf stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with resolve. He proposed to bring his fleet alongside the bridge, challenging the others to do the same. The Council of Saxons agreed, and with determination burning in their hearts, they prepared their ships and readied their men for the bold assault that would decide the fate of the kingdom. With the fleet and men ready for battle, Olaf and his Norse warriors rode up the river with a relentless determination. As they neared the bridge, a hailstorm of stones, arrows and spears rained down from above, so fierce that neither helmet nor shield could offer true protection. The ships themselves groaned under the onslaught, and many men would retreat from the merciless barrage. But Olaf, young and undaunted, led the Northmen forward, rowing straight to the base of the bridge. With swift precision, they looped their cables around the piles that held the bridge aloft, then rowed downstream with all of their might. The cables would strain, and the piles began to tremble beneath the weight of the bridge. Slowly but surely, the supports gave way. As the structure faltered, the heavily armoured troops standing on it, along with great heaps of stones and weapons, were thrown into chaos. The bridge collapsed, and many of the warriors were plunged into the cold waters of the River Thames. Those who survived the fall fled in terror, some seeking refuge in the castle, others retreating to Southwark. With the bridge destroyed, Southwark fell swiftly to Olaf's forces. The Norse berserkers would send the occupying Danes running for their lives. This would result in Prince Canute and his men fleeing from the city. The warriors and Londoners surrendered the tower and accepted Aethelred as their king once more. Thus, the tide of war shifted, and Olaf's bold strategy brought victory to the English king, as he once more sat upon the English throne. Olaf and his men would revel in their victory, drinking from horns in the great halls of Aethelred. Amid the revelry, a ballad of Olaf's triumph was composed. London Bridge is broken down, gold is won and bright renown, shields resounding, war horns sounding, Hild is shouting in the din, arrows singing, mailcoats ringing, Odin makes our Olaf win. Olaf and his men were a fearsome band of hardened Norse pagan warriors, their ferocity immortalised in sagas and ballads. Steeped in the ancient traditions of their ancestors, they fought with unmatched skill and relentless thirst for glory. Each swing of their swords carried the weight of generations of warriors before them, and their battle cries echoed the primal power of the Norse gods that they worshipped. Under Olaf's command, these warriors became a force to be reckoned with in England. Allying with King Aethelred, they fought with brutal efficiency, reclaiming fortress after fortress from the dead King Sweyn's occupying forces. Their victories were not just battles won, but statements of Norse and English dominance. Among these triumphs, one stood above the rest: the expulsion of Prince Canute, Sweyn's formidable son, from the shores of England. Canute, a man destined to be a king himself, found even his iron will bent before the might of Olaf and his warriors. Their relentless assaults drove him from the land, securing Aethelred's grip on the throne and solidifying Olaf's reputation as a hero for the Saxon cause. With every victory, Olaf's fame grew. His name was spoken with reverence and fear, both in the halls of kings and the whispers of common folk. Riches flowed into his coffers, spoils from the conquered castles and the grateful hands of Aethelred. Gold, silver and jewels piled high. But for Olaf, the true treasure was the legacy he was forging with every swing of his axe. Yet, despite the wealth and glory he amassed, a longing began to stir within him. Years had passed since he had last set foot on the soil of Norway. From the age of 12, Olaf had gone Viking, destined to be a warrior from the moment he could wield a blade. But Norway, the land of his birth, the realm his ancestors had once ruled, called to him like a distant echo. The blood of kings ran through his veins, a lineage that traced back to the great Harald Fairhair, the first to unite the fragmented kingdoms of Norway under one crown. Now Olaf felt the pull of that legacy, the weight of destiny urging him to reclaim what was rightfully his. Aethelred the Unready of England would die in the year 1016, and with Olaf now free from his oath, and with his promised land of Northumbria fading with the king's death, he would think of nothing but his homeland. He had won battles for another king, taken castles in foreign lands, and grown immensely rich. But it all paled in comparison to the yearning that now burned within him, a yearning to return home. He wouldn't return home, however, as a mere Viking, but as a king. His gaze had turned northward, to the rugged fjords and towering mountains of Norway, the kingdom where his ancestors had carved their names into history. With a heart full of ambition and spirit, unyielding as the Norse winds, Olaf prepared to embark on the greatest journey of his life, to reclaim Norway and fulfill his destiny. Olaf, now in his early 20s, was a battle-hardened warrior and was wealthy beyond measure. He would soon arrive in Normandy to trade his many spoils from his countless victories in England. He was welcomed into the court of Richard II, the Duke of Normandy, who recognised the Norseman's reputation and strength. In the grand city of the Rouen, Olaf found himself captivated by the towering cathedral that dominated the skyline. The imposing structure, with its soaring spires and intricate stonework, was unlike anything Olaf had ever seen. Richard and his men often attended mass there, and Olaf, curious and drawn to the solemnity of the rituals, began to accompany them. As he wandered through the sacred halls of the Rouen, he encountered monasteries filled with devoted monks and nuns, and priests leading their congregations in prayer. Bishops would guide their flocks with wisdom and grace, impressing the young Olaf. It was in these moments, amid the quiet reverence of the cathedral and the deep discussions with the archbishop, that Olaf began to question the old gods of his forefathers. The tales of Odin, Thor, and the Norse pantheon, once the foundation of his beliefs, began to loosen their grip on his soul. In their place, the teachings of Christianity took root, offering a path of redemption and purpose that resonated deeply within him. Convinced that this new faith was the true way forward, not just for himself, but for his homeland, Olaf made a monumental decision. In a solemn and transformative ceremony, Olaf renounced the life he had lived, the gods of his ancestors, the brutal ways of the Viking warrior, and embraced the Christian faith. before the altar of the great cathedral, under the watchful eye of Robert, the Archbishop of the Rouen, Olaf was baptized, the waters washing away the old and heralding the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Moreover, Olaf was deeply inspired by the legendary tales of Charlemagne, the great emperor who had united vast realms under one banner and spread the Christian faith across his empire. These stories ignited a powerful vision within Olaf, a vision of the strong and unified Norway, where the fractured clans of rival kings would be brought together, not by the sword alone, but by the unifying force of Christianity. He envisioned a kingdom where faith would serve as the foundation of his rule, forging a nation as enduring and mighty as the empires of old. With this vision burning in his heart, Olaf resolved to transform Norway into a powerful Christian realm. For 13 long years, Norway had been ruled by the descendants of Haakon the Poweful, the Earls of Lade, who served as regents under the shadow of Denmark's dominion. The legacy of the Fairhair line, once proud and unbroken, had faded with the death of Olaf Tryggvason, and since then, no king of that ancient lineage had claimed the throne. In their absence, Sweyn Forkbeard, the mighty king of Denmark, had seized control, wielding power over Norway through the puppet lords of Lade. The throne of Norway lay empty, the realm fractured and divided, yearning for a leader of true blood and vision. Across the stormy waters of the North Sea, a new hope emerged. Olaf, battle-hardened and wealthy from years of conquest, a warrior descended from the legendary Fairhair. Olaf's fleet cut through the icy waves, carrying with it a promise of a unified Norway. His goal was nothing less than to bring the petty kings, chiefs and earls under his command to forge a nation that would stand strong against any foe. Olaf, bold and determined, landed on the shores of Norway. He wasted no time and set about travelling across the land, making his presence known to the chieftains of every district. At that time, Norway was under the rule of Sweyn Hakonarsson, the Earl of Lade, a powerful leader backed by loyal kin and allies. They spoke out fiercely against Olaf's claim in every gathering, stirring the people against him. But Olaf, sensing the shifting tides of loyalty, decided to make a swift and strategic move. He hastened to the kingdom of the Vestfold, where his stepfather Sigurd Syr ruled. It was there, among familiar faces, that Olaf sought refuge and support. He arrived at the Vestfold, where Olaf was greeted warmly by his mother Asta and her children by Sigurd. Guthorm the eldest stood with pride. A young Sigurd looked up to Olaf with admiration, and Harald the youngest, later known to history as Harald Hardrada, gazed at his half-brother with awe, unaware that he too would one day carve his name into the annals of history. Sigurd Syr, recognizing the gravity of Olaf's ambition, welcomed him with the splendour befitting of a king. A grand feast was held in Olaf's honour, celebrating not only his triumphs abroad, but also his unwavering resolve to claim Norway's throne. The halls of the Vestfold echoed with songs of victory and glory. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and the sound of clashing horns. Olaf, surrounded by his family and newfound allies, knew that the time was near for him to make his move. The kingdom of Norway was within his grasp, and the fires of destiny burned brightly in his heart. Olaf embarked on a journey to the ancient lands of the Uplands, where fertile fields and dense forests stretched north of Oslo. These rich lands, steeped in history, were ruled by kings descended from noble lines, many of whom shed blood with Olaf, tracing their lineage back to the legendary house of Fairhair. With his stepfather Sigurd Syr by his side, Olaf sought to unite these petty kings under his banner, to reclaim the throne of Norway and cast out the influence of foreign rulers. Sigurd Syr, himself a descendant of Fairhair and the wise king of the Vestfold, joined Olaf in his mission. Together, they travelled to meet with the 5 district kings, rulers who held sway over these prosperous lands. In their council, Sigurd and Olaf spoke with conviction, urging the kings to join them in freeing Norway from Danish and Swedish control. King Sigurd would tell all of the other kings of Olaf's virtues, presenting him as the embodiment of their ideals, a powerful heir of Fairhair, a proven battle commander, and a fearless Viking. One of the kings with a solemn gaze spoke first. "It is true that Harald Fairhair's kingdom has fallen into decay, with none of his race holding dominion over all of Norway." The kings, reflecting on the past, recalled the days when their kinsman Olaf Tryggvason had ruled. Though he was of Fairhair's blood, his reign had been harsh, denying them the freedom to worship their gods as they pleased. Since his death, Norway had lived in an uneasy peace under the shadow of the Danish king, content to avoid conflict. Yet, there was a yearning among them for a king of their own blood, a ruler who could restore the glory of their lineage. One of the kings, his voice filled with longing, declared, "I would rather see my kin on the throne of Norway than bow to a foreign chief. I wish that my family could rise again, but only fate will decide if Olaf is destined to reclaim his kingdom." The night wore on as Olaf and Sigurd engaged in deep conversation with the kings, addressing their concerns, listening to their grievances, and forging bonds of trust. As the moon reached its zenith, one by one, the kings rose from their seats. With solemn words and heavy hearts, they swore their oaths to Olaf, pledging their loyalty and aid in his quest to become the supreme king of Norway. In return, Olaf promised them a reign of friendship and fairness. He vowed to improve the country's laws, to treat all with justice and honour, and to restore the greatness of Norway. The kings, now united in purpose, looked upon Olaf with newfound respect, for they saw in him the promise of a better future, a future where the blood of Fairhair would once again rule over a free and unified Norway. The kings convened a grand thing, a gathering of warriors, nobles and freemen, under the wide skies of Norway. The air crackled with anticipation as King Olaf stood before the assembly, his presence commanding respect. With a voice that echoed like thunder through the valleys, he declared his intentions to all the people. Olaf spoke of his right to the throne, the blood of kings that flowed within him, and his unwavering determination to rule as their sovereign. He called upon the kings, the landowners and warriors of Norway, to recognize him as their overlord and true king. In return, he pledged to uphold their ancient laws, to honor the traditions that had guided their forefathers, and to protect their land from the grasp of foreign invaders. His words were not merely a plea, but a promise forged in the fires of his many battles. He vowed to be the shield against the encroaching powers of Denmark and Sweden, the sword that would defend their freedom. Olaf's speech was powerful, filled with passion and conviction, and it resonated deeply with those who heard it. The people praised him, with their voices rising in agreement. One by one, the Upland kings who had gathered alongside him rose to speak. They too pledged their support for Olaf's claim. each king, with words of wisdom and resolve, urged the people to stand behind the rightful heir of Fairhair's lineage. Thus, in that fateful thing, Olaf was declared king over all of Norway. In the cold, iron-streaked winds of Norway, destiny hung heavy over the land. The mighty Earl of Lade, Sweyn Haakonsson, the ruler of Norway, soon learned that Olaf had been crowned king. Sweyn, a man of powerful lineage himself, descended from Haakon the Poweful and the fearsome Ivar the Boneless, and would not relinquish his power without a fight. Inevitably, the two titans of Norway were destined to clash in a battle that would decide the future of the kingdom. According to the sagas, Olaf's forces prepared for war. On board his ship, Olaf commanded 100 men, all clad in gleaming coats of ringmail, and crowned with foreign helmets that caught the sunlight like burning stars. The majority of his warriors bore shields as white as winter snow, adorned with the golden cross of Christ. Some among them, however, had painted their crosses in deep hues of blue and red, a vivid symbol of their faith and readiness for battle. Every helmet bore a pale cross at its front, a sacred mark of protection. Before setting out, the king commanded a mass to be read, invoking divine favour for the battle to come. His men then refreshed themselves with meat and drink, their hearts steeling with resolve. With oars slicing through the icy waters, Olaf's fleet surged forward, seeking the Earl. As they reached the harbour where Sweyn's forces lay in wait, they saw the Earl's men hastily arming themselves, their ships being bound together, banners raised and weapons drawn. The clash was imminent. King Olaf, seeing his enemies preparing for the fight, commanded his men to row harder. His ship cut through the waves with ferocious speed, and with a thunderous crash, it locked alongside the Earl's vessel, and the battle began. The battle saga recounts that King Olaf charged into the fray with a zeal unmatched, catching Earl Sweyn's forces unprepared as they still lingered in the harbour. Among those who fought was Sigvat the Skald, a poet and warrior, who later immortalised the fierce combat in his verses, known as the Nesjar song. No urging did the Earl require, midst spear and sword the battle's fire. No urging did the brave king need, the ravens in this shield storm to feed. Of limb lopping enough was there, and ghastly wounds of sword and spear. Never, I think, was rougher play than both armies had that day. Though Earl Sweyn commanded more men, King Olaf's crew was a force to be reckoned with. These were no ordinary warriors. They had followed their king through countless wars. Each man wore a cold, unyielding shirt of ringmail, so finely crafted that it turned aside blades and arrows alike. Sigvat's verses spoke of the scene. Our lads, broad-shouldered, tall and hale, drew on their cold shirts of ring mail. Soon sword on sword was shrilly ringing, and in the air the spears were singing. Under our helms we hid our hair, for thick flew arrows through the air. Right glad was I, our gallant crew, still clad from head to foot to view. The battle raged fiercely, but it soon became clear that Olaf's forces had the upper hand. The ferocity of their assault overwhelmed Earl Sweyn's men. The battlefield became a scene of carnage, as many of Sweyn's warriors fell, their blood staining the waters. Some, desperate to escape the slaughter, leaped overboard, seeking salvation in the sea. As the tide of battle turned against Sweyn Haakonsson, he soon realised his cause was lost. Defeated and broken, the once proud Earl abandoned the battlefield, fleeing into exile in Sweden, with the weight of his defeat heavy upon him. The battle for Norway was over, and Olaf stood victorious, a king, not just by blood, but by the sword. In addition, Sweyn would soon die in Sweden. He fell sick, and it proved fatal. Thus, Olaf's rule in Norway was now uncontested. Once more, King Olaf embarked on a journey to the Uplands, a land rich in beauty and wealth, where the ancient Norse gods still reigned in the hearts of the people. The rugged northern lands of Norway had long been a bastion of the old ways, where Odin, Thor and Freya were worshipped. But Olaf, zealous in his Christian faith, saw no room for the old gods in his kingdom. With the fires of fanaticism burning bright in his eyes, he summoned every man in those lands to bow before him and renounce their heathen beliefs. In solemn assembly, Olaf asked the men of the Uplands if any among them would dare defy him and cling to the gods of their ancestors, and indeed, some voices rose in defiance, refusing to abandon the deities who had protected their forefathers for generations. But defiance had a price. Olaf, unwavering in his faith, and perhaps maddened by his holy mission, unleashed a wave of brutal punishment upon those who stood against him. Some were mutilated, their hands and feet severed as a grisly reminder of their defiance. Others were blinded, condemned to darkness for refusing to see the light of Olaf's god. Some were hanged, their bodies left as grim warnings to others, and still more were slain by the sword, their blood staining the earth in the name of conversion. It was said that no heathen went unpunished under Olaf's reign, not until they bowed before his god and abandoned the old ways. His sword was the cross, and his justice was relentless. Earl and commoner alike felt the weight of his iron rule. Olaf's campaign of terror spread like wildfire through the uplands, as he moved from village to village, town to town, converting all who dared resist his word. He became known as Olaf the Lawbreaker to the common folk, as he did not abide by the laws of the land, and murdered in the name of his new god. But as news of Olaf's tyrannical rule reached the ears of the Upland kings, those who had once sworn loyalty to him, a simmering anger began to grow. These kings had bent the knee to Olaf after helping him defeat Sweyn, but they had not expected the iron-fisted rule that followed. In secret, they gathered for a council, speaking in hushed tones of the devastation Olaf was wreaking upon their lands. They whispered of the mutilations, the killings and the exiles, and to make matters worse, Olaf travelled with a vast army, far exceeding the legal limits for a royal progress, trampling over the law with impunity. They were reminded of Olaf Tryggvason's reign, and the district kings had directly told Olaf Haraldsson of their grievances against Tryggvason for not allowing them to worship their own gods. Thus, division arose among the kings. Some called for battle to meet Olaf's tyranny with steel. Others sought peace, hoping to reason with the mad king. And yet others, fearful of his wrath, wished to do nothing, to bide their time in silence. It was Gudrod, the king of the valley, who finally broke the stalemate. His voice rang out with defiance and anger. "It seems to me a wonder," he declared, "that we circle around this issue without resolution. Are we so frightened of this man? Here we stand, 5 kings, all of us of high birth, the same as Olaf himself. We gave him the strength to defeat Sweyn, and with our forces he seized this land. But now, if he dares to threaten us with torture and ill words, then I say for myself, I will no longer live as his slave." The words of Gudrod echoed throughout the hall, igniting the fury of the Upland kings. They had once sworn allegiance to Olaf, But now, seeing his madness and lust for power, they turned against him. Their anger was no longer about faith alone, it was about their very survival. Olaf's tyranny had pushed them too far, and now the storm that had been gathering in the shadows was about to break. Thus the Upland kings, once Olaf's allies, became his enemies, driven to rebellion by a king who could not tolerate their worship of the old gods, and whose thirst for power knew no bounds. When word reached Olaf of a secret meeting among the Upland kings, an alliance of nobles who questioned his rule and clung to the old gods, Olaf knew that the time for subtlety was over. One of his loyal spies had infiltrated the gathering and brought back word of their treacherous plans. The kings planned to rise up against Olaf, but Olaf would show them the true meaning of power. Realizing the gravity of the threat, Olaf wasted no time. With the precision of a seasoned tactician, he devised a plan to strike at the heart of the rebellion. He summoned his followers to gather horses, ensuring his forces could move swiftly across the rugged terrain. Other men were ordered to seize every boat along the lake, denying the rebels any means of escape. But Olaf's preparations went beyond mere logistics. Before the battle, he attended mass as was his custom, seeking divine favour for the bloodshed to come. He understood the power of faith and used it to fortify his own resolve. After the service, he took a brief meal, not a feast, but a warrior's sustenance before turning his full focus on the mission that lay ahead. Under the cloak of darkness, Olaf led his fleet of boats across the lake, a silent armada of 400 warriors, all hand-picked for their loyalty and skill. By the time they reached the fortress where the Upland king slept, it was just before dawn. The watchmen, unsuspecting and unprepared, had no time to raise an alarm. Olaf's forces slipped through the defences like shadows, surrounding the courtyard before the first rays of light touched the horizon. Olaf's knowledge of the king's whereabouts was no coincidence. His network of spies had given him the exact location of where the traitors slept. His men soon surrounded the houses where the kings would reside, and with brutal efficiency, they blocked every exit and trapped their enemies. When morning came, the kings awoke not to the light of day, but to the cold steel of Olaf's warriors, standing ready to capture them. The rebellion was crushed before it could even begin. The Upland kings, who once held sway over their lands, now found themselves at the mercy of a king who had none to give. One by one, the kings were dragged before Olaf, their dreams of resistance shattered. King Harald, known for his unyielding defiance, faced the harshest fate. Olaf, knowing that such a man could never be trusted, ordered his eyes to be gouged out, leaving him blind and powerless. Gudrod, another one of the rebel leaders, suffered a different but equally cruel punishment. His tongue was cut out, silencing him forever. As for King Ring and 2 others, they were banished from Norway, forced to swear to never return under pain of death. Thus, Olaf put an end to his distant kin and the petty kings of Norway. Olaf's vengeance did not stop with the kings. The nobles and farmers who had conspired with them faced their own grim fates. Some were driven from their lands, exiled like their leaders. Others were mutilated, their bodies marked as symbols of their failure. And for few, Olaf offered peace, but only in terms of total submission to his will and the Christian faith. Through his swift and merciless campaign, Olaf solidified his rule over the Uplands and sent a clear message to the rest of Norway. Resistance was futile, his power was absolute, and his mission to convert the land to the Christian faith would not be stopped. The old gods were fading, and in their place, the cross of Olaf rose. King Olaf took possession of the land that these 5 kings had possessed, and Olaf now alone bore the title of king in Norway. He would rule the land as he wished, converting the people as was his will. As Olaf ascended to the throne of Norway, a formidable rival loomed over the horizon, Prince Canute, the same man Olaf had now bested at the Battle of London Bridge. But Canute's fortunes had soared since that defeat. He now reigned as king of both Denmark and England, and his name was spoken with reverence across the North Sea. His battle prowess was legendary, and his dominion vast. To counter Canute's growing power, Olaf forged an alliance with Anund Jacob, the King of Sweden. Their alliance was sealed through Olaf's marriage to Anund's sister Astrid. With their forces combined, the two kings saw an opportunity to strike while Canute's attention was focused on his English kingdom. They launched a daring raid on the coasts of Denmark, wreaking havoc on Canute's homeland and setting fire to his ancestral seat. Enraged in the year 1026, Canute retaliated with the full might of his empire. He summoned a colossal navy, amassing to around 600 ships, each more fearsome than the last. His flagship alone was said to stretch 80 meters in length, a behemoth on the waves. Olaf and Anund Jacob, knowing they could not match his fleet head-on, devised a cunning plan. They organised the construction of a massive dam of peat and lumber on the river, intending to use the land itself as a weapon. When the Danish navy sailed in, the dam was released, unleashing a torrent of water that swept through countless Danes and Englishmen, the waters churning with the debris of shattered ships and drowned men. But Canute's main fleet lay beyond the river harbour, untouched by the flood. As the survivors of the initial attack regrouped, the full might of Canute's navy began to bear down on the two kings. Realising that fate had granted them all the victory they could achieve for the moment, Olaf and Anund ordered their ships to retreat. Had they continued the fight, they would have faced utter destruction, for Canute's numbers were overwhelming. Even though Canute had lost many ships, his sheer force of arms ensured his victory. His enemies fled before his might, acknowledging the superiority of his fleet. As Olaf and Anund Jacob regrouped and sought to renew their strength, darker tidings reached them. Canute, relentless in his ambition, had amassed an even larger armada of 1,200 ships, intent on conquering all of Norway. Olaf's rule, harsh and unforgiving with its forced conversions and brutal suppression of the old gods, had sown the seeds of discontent among the Norwegian chiefs and nobles. Memories of Sweyn Forkbeard's reign, when paganism had been tolerated and the old gods still held sway, stirred in their hearts. Canute, ever the tactician, had sent his own spies into Norway. Armed with gold and promises, they whispered to the nobles that under Canute's rule, they could return to their old ways without fear of persecution. Tempted by Canute's boundless wealth and his offer of religious freedom, the Norwegian chieftains grew hesitant to rally behind Olaf for the coming battle. They saw in Canute not only a conqueror, but a potential liberator from Olaf's oppressive hand. Thus, as the storm of war gathered once more, Olaf faced not only the threat of Canute's massive fleet, but also the threat of his own people. The fate of Norway hung in the balance, poised between the old gods and the new, between the iron rule of Olaf and the seductive power of Canute. Sigvat the Scald tells of it thus: "Our men are few, our ships are small, while England's king is strong in all. But yet our king is not afraid. Oh, never be such king betrayed. 'Tis evil counsel to deprive our king of countrymen to strive to save their country sword in hand. 'Tis money that betrays our land." After the fierce Battle of Nesjar, the tides of fortune turned against Olaf. Canute, the ever-calculating ruler of Denmark and England, landed in Norway with his seemingly boundless army, ready to lay claim to the kingdom. But Canute, wise in the ways of war and politics, knew that brute force was not the only path to power. Instead of ravaging the land, he employed a strategy of diplomacy, winning the hearts and minds of the Norwegians, who had grown angry with their king. Olaf's harsh rule and forced conversions had alienated many, and Canute was quick to exploit this resentment. Canute called for a grand thing, the ancient assembly where the kings of Norway had been crowned for generations. In this sacred gathering, beneath the weight of tradition and history, Canute asserted his claim. The thing was attended by a formidable array of Danish and English warriors, earls, chiefs and lords. Norwegian nobles and Northmen also gathered, their loyalties shifting as they watched the unfolding events. In a moment of great solemnity, Canute was chosen as the King of Norway, marking the dawn of a new era. His ascension cemented his control over a vast North Sea empire, making him the most powerful Viking in living memory, a ruler whose reach extended across England, Denmark and now Norway. Canute, ever the shrewd leader, entrusted the regency of Norway to Haakon Eriksson, the Earl of Lade, a man of noble lineage and the nephew to Sweyn Haakonsson. Haakon, a descendant of the legendary Haakon the Poweful, was well respected in Norway, and his appointment further solidified Canute's rule. Thus, without the need for further bloodshed, Canute had conquered Norway, not by the sword, but by the force of his will and the loyalty he inspired. King Olaf, once the fierce ruler of Norway, found himself abandoned by his people and was forced into exile. No longer welcome in his own homeland, he sought refuge in the distant lands of the Kievan Rus. During his exile, Olaf spent time in many Swedish provinces, where according to legend, he baptized many of the locals, continuing his mission to spread Christianity. But in the year 1029, fate offered him a chance to reclaim his throne. Canute's regent in Norway, Jarl Haakon Eriksson, was lost at sea, leaving a power vacuum in the kingdom. Sensing an opportunity, Olaf prepared to return to Norway and reclaim what was once his. With the backing of the Swedish king Anund Jacob, Olaf gathered his forces, determined to avoid the formidable Danish fleet guarding the port towns and cities of Norway. He led his army across the treacherous mountains, aiming to take Nidaros, the capital of Norway, by surprise in the year 1030. When Olaf landed on Norwegian soil, he was reunited with his youngest brother, Harald Sigurdsson, a boy of 15 years of age, but he was already a warrior in spirit and stature. Harald, though young, commanded respect, and he provided Olaf with a contingent of men from Ringerike. The two brothers, long separated by war and exile, reconciled with each other. For Harald, Olaf had always been a hero, and now they stood side by side, ready to face the trials that awaited them. As Olaf prepared to reclaim his kingdom, the stage was set for one final epic clash, a battle that would decide the fate of Norway and the legacy of its king. Olaf and his army would march north, their footsteps echoing through the rugged lands of Norway, until they reached Stiklestad, a farm nestled in the lower part of a valley near Trondheim. Here, beneath the brooding skies, Olaf would face his destiny in a battle that would be etched in the annals of history. The Battle of Stiklestad, fought in the year 1030. His enemy, the so-called Farmer Army, was a force of Norwegians loyal to Canute the Great, the ruler who sought to cement his hold over the land that Olaf once called his own. Olaf's men, driven by faith and loyalty, raised their voices in a thunderous battle cry. Forward, forward, men of Christ, men of the cross, men of the King. Across the field, the farmer army responded with equal fervour. Forward, forward, farmers. The clash of ideals and loyalties was about to explode into a symphony of blood and steel. Though Canute himself was absent from the battlefield, his will was enforced by the Norwegian chieftains, who stood ready to defend their land against the return of Olaf. The two forces met in a storm of chaos, the ground trembling under the weight of the warriors' charge. Swords clashed, shields splintered, the air was full of the cries of the wounded and dying. In the midst of the fray, Olaf emerged from behind his shield wall, placing himself at the head of his army. His presence was awe-inspiring, a beacon of defiance against the pagan forces that opposed him, his golden helmet gleaming under the sunlight, a symbol of his royal power, while his shield, adorned with the holy cross and trimmed with gold, shone with divine purpose. But it was his battle axe Hel that struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. To the pagan farmers, Olaf was no mere mortal. He was a champion of the new religion, a warrior clad in the armour of Christ. Yet even legends can be overwhelmed. Amidst the swirling chaos of the battle, Olaf was beset by enemies from all sides. An axe struck his thigh, a brutal blow that brought the king to his knees. Gasping for breath, Olaf staggered towards a stone, throwing down his sword as he prayed for God's aid in his final moments. But the battle was unforgiving. Before divine intervention could come, a spear pierced through his mail coat and buried itself deep within his belly. Bloodied and broken, Olaf's strength began to fade. In his final moments, a warrior approached, his eyes cold and resolute. With a swift slash of his sword, the warrior severed Olaf's neck, and the King of Norway fell to the ground lifeless. With his death, the cause of Christ and King faltered. The once mighty army of Olaf, now leaderless, either dispersed into the wilderness or were cut down where they stood. The Battle of Stiklestad marked the end of Olaf's reign, but the legacy of the fallen king would echo through the sagas. In death, Olaf became a martyr, his story woven into the fabric of Norway's history, a tale of faith, sacrifice, and the fierce struggle for a nation's soul. Upon Olaf's death, whispers of miracles began to spread like wildfire. Among the warriors who had fought that day, one man, his hands wounded from the brutal combat, approached Olaf's lifeless body. As he wiped the blood from Olaf's cheeks, the blood trickled down his fingers, and to his astonishment, the wounds healed without needing to be bound. Some said that Olaf's power transcended death. After the Battle of Stiklestad, Olaf's body was placed in a humble hut. Beggars and the poor had followed the armies in hopes of scraps of food, and they lingered nearby. One blind man, weary and desperate, stumbled into the hut seeking refuge. The cold, damp floor offered him little comfort, but as he lay there, he felt moisture beneath him. He rubbed his eyes with his wet hands, but soon realized he would find no sleep in the wet, damp hut. So he stumbled out, but something had changed. His sight had returned. He looked down and saw his hands were stained red with Olaf's blood, the very blood that had restored his vision. News of these miracles reached far and wide, and soon the Archbishop Grimketel was summoned to Norway. Upon hearing the stories and witnessing the healed and the blessed, Grimketel declared Olaf a saint, the first sainted king of Norway. Olaf who had died as a king in battle, was reborn as a martyr and as a beacon of faith. 40 years after his death, in the year 1070, Olaf's legacy had only grown stronger. His shrine in Nidaros became a sacred pilgrimage site, drawing the faithful from every corner of the Norse world. He was now known as Norway's eternal king, and churches bearing his name sprang up across the land, even reaching the distant Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. His influence crossed the seas, with even churches in England dedicated to his memory. As the centuries passed, Olaf's story transformed into legend. He became not just a king, but a slayer of trolls and giants, a protector against dark forces. His healing powers attracted pilgrims to his shrine. Today, Olaf stands as Norway's patron saint, enshrined in Nidaros Cathedral, one of the most revered figures in the nation's history. Yet, the historical Olaf is a figure shrouded in contradictions. By the accounts of his time, he was a tyrant, a ruler who betrayed his own kin. He wiped out the Norse petty kings and deceived those who trusted him. He waged a brutal campaign to force the pagans to convert to Christianity, with his methods being ruthless, his reign marked by violence and fanaticism. But as time passed, the harshness of his rule faded from memory, and only the saintly legacy endured. Olaf's lineage did not die with him. His son Magnus the Good would reclaim the Norwegian crown, and his younger brother Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, would continue the saga of their dynasty, forging his own legendary path. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all soon for another History Profile.